The eviction notice was taped so boldly to his door it felt like a public execution. He dropped to his knees, whispering for mercy, only to realize someone else was listening from across the marble lobby, a woman who hadn't heard that voice in 15 years. Before we dive in, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? Don't forget to hit subscribe because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. You don't want to miss what's coming next. The knock rattled the thin wooden door like it might splinter straight through. Marcus Reed froze mid-step, one hand still wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, the other tugging at the sleeve of his faded work shirt. Morning light slanted weakly through the blinds, catching the dust that never quite left the air. He set the mug down slowly, careful not to let it clink against the counter, as if silence could erase the sound that had already shaken the apartment. At the kitchen table, Emma sat hunched over a piece of paper, her pencil scratching in determined little strokes. 10 years old and already too good at pretending not to hear. Her blonde hair fell in front of her face like a curtain. She pushed it back with her wrist, smudging graphite across her cheek, and kept drawing. A sun in the corner, a crooked house, a stick figure with big hands holding a smaller one. Her world simplified into crayons and paper safer than the truth hanging outside their door. The knock came again, louder this time, impatient. Marcus closed his eyes, exhaled. He knew that rhythm, the kind of knock that didn't wait for permission to enter. He opened the door before the third hit landed. A deputy stood there in a crisp brown uniform, hat low, eyes tired from saying the same words to too many people. Without ceremony, he peeled a sheet of paper from the folder in his hand and slapped it against the doorframe with a strip of tape. The bright orange screamed louder than any voice. Marcus stared at it. The letters swam for a second, blurred by the sudden sting in his eyes. Then they snapped into focus. 72 hours to vacate. The deputy adjusted his belt, cleared his throat. "Sir, you've had notices." "This isn't a surprise." "I just need a little more time," Marcus said quickly. His voice cracked, and he hated himself for it. He straightened, tried again, steadier. "One more paycheck. I've got shifts lined up. Just give me till the end of the week." The deputy shook his head, not cruel, not kind, just practiced. "It's out of my hands." Rules are rules. He tapped the paper with 2 fingers like it was scripture. Then he turned and walked down the hall, boots echoing against the peeling linoleum. Marcus stood in the doorway long after the man disappeared. The hallway felt colder, emptier, like the walls themselves had stepped back in judgment. The paper flapped once in a faint draft, bright and merciless. Behind him, a chair scraped. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. He turned. She was sitting upright now, pencil still in hand, her drawing forgotten. Her wide eyes darted from his face to the orange paper, then back again. She didn't ask the question out loud. She didn't have to. He crossed the room in 3 strides, crouched in front of her, forcing a smile that felt brittle in his cheeks. "Hey, it's fine." "Is it bad?" she whispered. He reached for her hand, covered it with his calloused palm. She was still small enough that her fingers disappeared under his. He swallowed hard, forced the words past the lump in his throat. "We'll be okay." It was the line he'd used 100 times before, after the hospital bills, after her mother's absence, after every late rent slip slipped under their door. But this time, even as the words left his mouth, he heard the fracture in them. So did she. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded once, but her eyes lingered on him longer than usual, searching, testing. Marcus stood, brushing a hand across the back of his neck, pacing to the window. Outside, the city stretched indifferent and loud, engines coughing, horns stabbing the air. Life kept moving. But inside this small apartment, time had slowed to a crawl. He pressed a hand against the glass, cool, under his palm, and stared down at the people rushing across the street, every one of them carrying their own secret weights. Behind him, Emma picked up her pencil again. He turned just enough to see her add something new to her drawing, a big orange square taped to the side of the stick figure house. Marcus closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt like he had no words left to promise her. And yet, tomorrow, when the knock came again, he knew he'd still be standing here, whispering lies as soft as prayers. The morning stretched like a punishment, every tick of the clock louder than the last. Marcus sat at the edge of the sagging couch, prepaid phone clutched so tight in his palm it left faint ridges in his skin. He scrolled through contacts that felt like a roll call of ghosts, names he hadn't spoken to in years, numbers he wasn't sure even worked anymore. Still, he dialed. He listened to the hollow ring, the metallic click of voicemail, and the two bright voices telling him to leave a message after the tone. He left them, fumbling promises he knew sounded thin. "I'll pay you back, I just need to cover rent, just need to get through the week." When the beeps cut him off, he stared at the black screen like it had betrayed him. Old Army buddies first. Men who had once trusted him with their lives now didn't answer a call. One number was disconnected. Another rang out endlessly before collapsing into silence. He tried coworkers from his security job, night shift guys who swapped stale coffee and stories about aching feet. No answer. The silence on the other end wasn't just empty. It was a door slamming shut each time, echoing in his chest louder than any voice. From the kitchen came the faint sound of zippers and Velcro. Emma was packing her school bag, her movements deliberate, like she thought being careful could make the morning less fragile. He turned slightly, watching her small shoulders under the worn sweatshirt she'd outgrown. She kept her face down, not asking questions, not interrupting. It was a kindness that felt like a blade. She knew when not to make noise. She'd learned that too young. Marcus rubbed his face with the heel of his hand, muttering curses into his palm. He dialed the church. The deacon's number still worked. For a second, hope fluttered, but the voicemail was brisk and businesslike. "Leave your name and number, and we'll return your call during office hours." He didn't bother leaving his. He hung up before the beep finished. His pride had already bled enough for one morning. Emma walked past him quietly, slipping something into his jacket pocket on the arm of the couch. He caught the movement out of the corner of his eye, but didn't stop her. After she disappeared into her room, he pulled it out. A picture drawn in crayon, their apartment building, lopsided but tall, a crooked sun in the corner, and in front of it, two stick figures holding hands. She'd even drawn his security guard badge, a square on his chest, bigger than life. Both of them smiling like the world had never touched them. His throat tightened. The paper felt heavier than it should. She was drawing a memory they were about to lose, trying to freeze it in colors before it vanished. He pressed it to his leg, folding it once, then again, before tucking it back into his pocket like a talisman. By noon, his phone buzzed. He snatched it up so fast, he nearly dropped it. The landlord's number flashed across the screen. Relief cracked for a second, thinking maybe there was room to negotiate, maybe a payment plan. He answered quickly, "Listen, I just need a little more time. I've got shifts lined up." But the voice on the other end was flat, efficient. The movers were already scheduled. Noon on Saturday, 3 days. Not a negotiation, just information. Marcus tried anyway. Words spilled faster, desperate. He promised double rent next month, offered to pay half today, begged for one more week. His voice cracked mid-sentence, raw from pleading, but the line was already dead. The landlord had hung up clean like cutting a cord. The silence that followed filled the apartment heavier than any sound. It pressed in on the walls, on his chest, on the space between him and his daughter. For the first time in years, Marcus Reed, man who had led soldiers through combat, man who had kept strangers safe in empty lobbies at night, felt utterly voiceless. He lowered the phone slowly, set it on the table, and stared at his reflection in the black screen. It didn't look like him anymore. In the other room, Emma hummed softly to herself, a tune he couldn't place, her small voice fragile but steady. He closed his eyes and listened. It was the only sound in the apartment that didn't feel like defeat. Dinner was nothing more than boxed macaroni, the kind Marcus could buy in bulk when the paycheck ran too thin. He stirred it absent-mindedly, watching the powdery cheese dissolve into something that looked brighter than it tasted. Emma sat across from him, head bent over her workbook, her pencil tapping out an uneven rhythm. She looked like she was doing math problems, but Marcus knew better. Children didn't miss much, not when silence in a home grew thick enough to breathe. He tried to keep his sighs quiet, tried to smile when she looked up for approval on an answer, but his eyes betrayed him. He felt them, heavy, raw, leaking the truth no matter how carefully he packaged it. Emma didn't say anything. She never did when he looked like that. Instead, she colored the edges of her math sheet with little flowers, trying to make the paper prettier, trying to patch what she couldn't fix. After dinner, Marcus stood at the sink rinsing plates while Emma disappeared into her room. The faucet hissed, the drain gurgled, and he leaned on the counter, staring at the chipped tile backsplash. He pressed both hands flat against the counter as if bracing himself against an earthquake. He didn't hear her small footsteps until she was already back, her school backpack dragging along the floor with a sound too heavy for something so small. She climbed onto one of the chairs at the table and dumped the bag upside down. Crayons rolled across the wood, notebooks slid to the edge, a library book flopped open like a broken bird. And then came the treasure, a handful of coins, clinking softly as they hit the pile. A few folded dollar bills, crumpled and worn from being handled too many times. A pink plastic bracelet with fake rhinestones that had once been her most prized possession. She pushed them together with both palms, nudging the pile toward the center of the table. Marcus turned from the sink, dish towel in hand. "What's all this?" Emma kept her eyes on the coins. Her voice was quiet, shaky, but certain. "Maybe this will help." For a moment, Marcus couldn't move. The world narrowed to the tiny mountain of childhood sacrifice in front of him. The pink bracelet glinted under the overhead light, innocent and devastating all at once. He walked slowly toward her like he was approaching something sacred. His throat burned. "Sweetheart." He crouched beside the chair until his eyes were level with hers. "Where did you—" "My allowance," she whispered quickly, almost defensive. "Birthday money. I saved it. I was going to buy rollerblades, remember? But we need it more." Her words cracked him wide open. He pressed a hand to his mouth, trying to keep steady, but it was no use. He let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. Carefully, he reached out and picked up the bracelet, turning it between his fingers. "You swore you'd never give this up." She nodded, eyes finally lifting to meet his. "That was before." Marcus set the bracelet back down gently, like it might shatter if he wasn't careful. He took her hands in his, rough palms engulfing her small fingers. "Emma, you're my miracle. You know that?" Her lip quivered, but she didn't cry. Instead, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, holding tight. He closed his eyes and pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her small frame pressed against him. For a moment, the world stopped spinning. For a moment, he let himself believe in the kind of love that could build a shelter where money couldn't. But when she finally let go, when her arms slid back to her sides and she wiped her nose with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, reality rushed back in. His eyes flicked to the calendar pinned to the wall, days crossed off in black marker. Tomorrow was Friday. That gave them less than 48 hours before the movers came. He stood slowly, squeezing her shoulder. "Miracles sometimes need more than quarters," he said softly, almost to himself. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. She just stayed close, and in that closeness he felt a resolve spark in him, faint but real. The kind of fire a father clings to when the dark corners close in. The clock ticked loudly in the kitchen. Each sound was a reminder. Time wasn't slowing down. It was racing toward them, bold and merciless, and he had no idea how to stop it. The morning air was crisp, but Marcus barely felt it as he walked hand in hand with Emma down the crowded sidewalk. His security badge swung from a frayed lanyard against his chest, catching the light every so often, like it wanted to remind him who he was, or maybe who he wasn't anymore. Emma clutched her sketchbook to her chest, her sneakers scuffing against the concrete. She didn't ask why she had to come with him this time. She didn't complain about the early hour. She just walked, silent but present, a little shadow at his side. He knew she understood more than she ever said. Leaving her alone in the apartment with that bright eviction notice screaming from the door wasn't an option, not today. The high-rise loomed ahead, all glass and steel, its edges sharp enough to cut the skyline. Inside, the lobby gleamed under polished chandeliers, marble floors shining like water. The air smelled faintly of lilies and something citrus, a stark contrast to the stale scent of their own cramped building. Marcus swiped his card, nodded to the morning desk clerk, and held the door open for Emma. She paused a moment, looking up at the soaring ceiling, eyes wide, like she'd stepped into another world. "Stay close, okay?" he murmured. She nodded, already pulling out her pencils. He guided her to a quiet corner near a potted plant, setting her small backpack against the wall. She settled, cross-legged on the marble, flipping her sketchbook open as though she'd been waiting for this moment all week. He bent down, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You'll be good?" She grinned, that small flash of light she always carried, and said, "Always." Marcus straightened his uniform shirt, tugged the creases that never seemed to disappear, and started his rounds. He checked badges at the door, offered a polite nod to residents rushing past with designer briefcases and paper cups of overpriced coffee. His voice was calm, steady, practiced. He knew how to blend into this place, how to make himself useful without being seen. Halfway through his shift, a woman in a tailored coat approached, irritation already written on her face. "The panel in elevator 3 is loose again," she said sharply. "It rattled the whole way down." "Frankly, it's unacceptable." Marcus listened without interruption, nodding at the right moments. He held her gaze long enough to show respect, but never long enough to challenge. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he said, his voice low even, carrying a gentleness that softened the edges of her frustration. "I'll log the repair right away and make sure maintenance gets to it before noon." She huffed but seemed pacified, her irritation deflating just slightly under the weight of his steadiness. She walked off, heels clicking an uneven rhythm across the marble. Marcus exhaled quietly, scribbling a note on his clipboard. From across the lobby, another pair of heels struck the floor with deliberate precision. This sound was different, measured, confident, commanding. A woman in a fitted charcoal suit and a deep red coat draped over her arm walked briskly, her phone in one hand, a leather portfolio in the other. She was halfway to the elevators when his voice carried across the lobby again, softer this time, as he reassured another tenant. She stopped. It was subtle at first, just a pause mid-stride, the way someone freezes when they think they've heard their name in a crowd. Her phone lowered slightly. She turned her head toward him, toward that voice, steady and low, carrying more than words. Her heart gave an unexpected lurch. She hadn't heard it in years, not since the lecture halls and late-night debates of college, when his words had been fire and conviction, filling rooms and silencing doubters. Back then he had spoken like a man certain of who he was, who he could become. Life had pressed him down since then. She could hear it in the weariness under his tone, but even buried, the core of that voice was unchanged. Her heels no longer clicked. They stilled against the marble, rooted. She stared across the gleaming lobby, past the well-dressed tenants, past the polished stone, at the man in the security uniform who bent his head politely, scribbled notes with quiet diligence, and carried his voice like a lantern in the dark. And though he hadn't seen her yet, though he had no idea she was there, something in her chest whispered, "Marcus Reed." Victoria Hale moved like a woman who owned the ground beneath her heels. At 39, she had perfected the art of walking through lobbies without looking, of slicing through silence with a phone call, of bending the air around her into obedience. The red coat over her arm wasn't just fabric. It was a signal, a splash of defiance in a world of navy suits and gray wool. People turned their heads when she entered rooms, not because she wanted them to, but because she had taught herself to exist that way. Power was her armor, polish her weapon, and she wore both like second skin. But then she heard him. The voice drifted across the gleaming lobby, low and steady, carrying apology without weakness, calm without pretense. It shouldn't have stopped her, not after all these years, but it did. One word, then another, and she froze mid-stride, her phone slipping just slightly in her hand. Her chest tightened with something dangerously close to recognition. She turned her head, and there he was, Marcus Reed. Older now, lines carved into his face that hadn't been there before, hair flecked with gray, shoulders bent slightly under the weight of a job designed to make men invisible. He stood in a security uniform, clipboard in hand, bowing his head to soothe some tenant's petty frustration about a rattling elevator panel. His voice was gentle, respectful, and achingly familiar. Victoria felt the world tilt. She remembered nights in the university library when he sat across from her, explaining history dates she could never remember, his voice coaxing the panic out of her chest. She remembered laughing too loud in the dorm common room at some joke he'd made, both of them too broke for anything more than stale pizza, but rich in the way young people sometimes are, believing the future was theirs for the taking. He had been her anchor then, when her family's expectations felt suffocating, and now he was here. A guard, a man whose voice once filled rooms, now reduced to nodding at complaints about loose screws. The contrast jarred her. It unsettled something she didn't know she'd been guarding all these years. She lingered near a marble column, shifting her coat to her other arm, pretending to check her phone. Her assistant, a sharp young man juggling a tablet and 2 folders, glanced back. "Miss Hale?" The board's waiting. Her lips parted, but no words came. The meeting, the numbers, the carefully polished presentation, all of it slipped further away with each second she stood there listening to the cadence of Marcus's voice. "Start without me," she said finally. The assistant blinked. "Without you?" "Yes." Her tone was clipped, final. "Go." He hesitated, then scurried off, leaving her half hidden behind the column, her pulse quickening in a way she hadn't felt in years. Curiosity swelled first, sharp and insistent. What had happened to him? Guilt followed, heavier, because she realized she had never wondered until now. Recognition settled last, quieter but more dangerous. It whispered that she still knew him, even after all this silence. Marcus hadn't seen her yet. He was focused on his work, methodical, steady. And maybe that was for the best, because Victoria wasn't sure what her face would betray if their eyes met. Her grip tightened on the phone in her hand. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't seen him, pretend his voice hadn't unraveled her composure, but something in her chest, a voice softer and older than all the ones she used in boardrooms, whispered, "Don't walk away this time." So she stayed, hidden in plain sight, heart unsteady, staring at the man she once thought she'd never lose, and wondering if she had the courage to step back into a life she thought was long behind her. He was bent over his clipboard, scribbling a note about the faulty elevator panel when he heard his name. Marcus? It was a voice from another lifetime, one that sliced through the hum of the lobby and froze him mid-sentence. He looked up, blinking against the sharp lobby lights, and for a moment he couldn't place her. Then memory snapped into focus. Victoria? The name left his lips like it had been stored away for years, gathering dust. His voice was rougher now, lower, worn down by nights without enough sleep and years of holding back everything he couldn't say. But beneath the gravel, the cadence was the same, the rhythm of someone who had once explained history dates to her under flickering dorm lights, who had once steadied her with words alone. She smiled, though it wasn't the polished smile she wore in magazines or company announcements. It was smaller, almost tentative, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to be standing in front of him after so many years. "I thought it was you," she said. "I almost didn't believe it." Marcus shifted his weight, adjusting the cap on his head, suddenly aware of the uniform stretched across his shoulders, the scuffed boots, the clipboard clutched too tightly in his hand. Years of hardship had carved something into him, a quiet armor that didn't allow for easy warmth. His nod was polite but guarded. "It's been a long time." Beside him, Emma looked up from her sketchbook. She studied Victoria with wide, curious eyes, then edged a little closer to her father, as if shielding him with her small frame. Protective without knowing she was being protective. Victoria's gaze flicked down to the girl, then back up. "Your daughter?" "Yeah," Marcus said simply. He rested a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Emma." Emma gave the faintest nod before turning her attention back to the page in her lap, but she didn't move far. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken years. Victoria searched his face for a trace of the boy she had once known, the one who had carried fire in his voice and hope in his eyes. She found pieces of him, buried under lines of fatigue, tempered by loss, but still there. "I know you're working," she said carefully, "but would you let me buy you a coffee after your shift? Just to catch up. Nothing formal." The question landed like a weight in his chest. Coffee. It sounded simple. But nothing about this felt simple. She stood before him in a tailored suit and flawless posture, the kind of woman who could close billion-dollar deals before breakfast. He stood in a uniform designed to blend him into the background, carrying the smell of disinfectant and long nights. The gap between them yawned wide, and he felt the sting of humiliation at the thought of sitting across from her now, not as equals, but as evidence of how far he'd fallen. He hesitated, searching for a way to say no without saying no. His jaw tightened, his grip on the clipboard leaving faint imprints on the paper. Then Emma tugged lightly at his sleeve. He looked down. She leaned closer, her voice a whisper, meant only for him. "It might help," she said. Her words struck deeper than she could have known, not because he believed coffee could fix anything, but because she had said them with a trust that reminded him of who he used to be, someone who didn't walk away from people who mattered. He looked back at Victoria. She was waiting, patient, though he could see a flicker of nerves behind her composed expression. He gave a slow nod. "After my shift." Her smile softened, real this time. "Good." She glanced at Emma once more before stepping back, slipping seamlessly into the stream of executives heading for the elevators. Marcus exhaled, his chest burning with unease. He could feel Emma's eyes on him, studying, measuring. He ruffled her hair gently, though his hand trembled. "Coffee," he muttered, almost to himself. "What good is coffee going to do?" Emma shrugged, her pencil scratching against the page again. "Guess we'll find out." He stared after Victoria, the echo of her heels still ringing in the marble lobby. And for the first time in years, Marcus Reed felt the past pressing against the present, demanding to be heard. The cafe was quiet in the way places are when the lunch rush hasn't yet begun. The hum of the espresso machine filled the pauses between conversations, and the windows framed the city in late morning sunlight, glass towers glinting like polished coins. Marcus sat stiffly in the corner booth, his uniform cap resting on the table beside his coffee, a silent reminder of where he'd come from and where he would return once the hour was over. He kept his hands folded tightly around the mug, as though warmth alone could steady him. Victoria slid into the seat across from him, her red coat draped neatly over the backrest, her posture straight but not rigid. Still, she radiated something untouchable, the air of a woman accustomed to being listened to, deferred to. Marcus noticed the way the barista glanced at her twice, not because she was famous, but because she carried herself like someone who knew exactly what the world owed her and how to collect it. Their words stumbled at first, clumsy and safe. She asked about the weather, and he answered with a half shrug. He mentioned how the city's winters hadn't softened since college, and she smiled faintly, agreeing. They spoke of old professors, of how history lectures had always run too long, of the campus coffee shop where he once worked shifts between classes. It was almost pleasant, a fragile echo of a past that didn't feel real anymore. But then she set her cup down with deliberate care, her eyes steady on his. "What happened, Marcus?" The words landed like stones. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw locking as if bracing against impact. He stared down at the dark swirl in his coffee, searching for the right answer, but finding only silence. Pity was something he couldn't stomach, not from her, not from anyone. He wasn't a headline, a sob story, or one of those tired charity cases she could rescue with the stroke of a pen. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, pared down to bone. Life happened. He paused, forced himself to look up. Bills. Emma. Victoria studied him with an intensity that unsettled him. Not the analytical stare she gave opponents across a boardroom table, but something softer, more searching. Like she was peeling back the years, still seeing the boy who once debated professors with fire in his chest, who once made her laugh until she forgot what loneliness felt like. Marcus shifted, uneasy under the weight of her gaze. He pushed his chair back slightly, the scrape loud against the tile. "I should go," he said, already reaching for his cap. She leaned forward suddenly, words tumbling out faster than she meant them to. "Your voice? It hasn't changed." He stopped, cap halfway to his head, and blinked at her. "What?" She swallowed, her cheeks coloring faintly, but she didn't back down. "I mean, it's different, sure, rougher. You've lived more. But underneath, it's the same voice. Back in college, you used to calm me down before exams. I'd panic, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. And then you'd talk to me, just talk. About anything. The French Revolution, baseball scores, whatever. And it worked, every time." Marcus stared at her, bewildered. He hadn't thought about those nights in years, hadn't remembered how she used to call him her human anchor. Back then, he was just trying to help a friend breathe. Now, she was telling him it had mattered more than he ever knew. He sat back down slowly, his cap still in his hand. He didn't know what to say. He didn't understand why she would bring it up now, why she would still carry the memory of his voice when he barely recognized it himself. Victoria looked at him across the table, her eyes softer than they'd been all morning. She wondered, though she didn't say it out loud, if that same voice, weathered now by time and loss, could still heal, if it could still steady her, or maybe even steady him. Marcus lowered his gaze, embarrassed by the weight of her words, and muttered something about needing to get back to work. But as he stood again, he realized his chest didn't feel as heavy as it had when he walked in. Something in her reminder, fragile, unexpected, had cracked the silence he'd been carrying for years. He didn't know what it meant, but it lingered, like the faint warmth of a flame he thought had gone out long ago. The hallway smelled of cardboard and dust when Marcus pushed open the apartment door that evening. The thud of footsteps and the scrape of boxes came from just down the hall, and he froze, heart racing. Two movers in gray shirts shuffled past, balancing a dresser between them, the wood gouged from years of use. Behind them, a woman from the next apartment stood wringing her hands, watching her life carried out piece by piece. Panic clawed at Marcus's chest. He could feel it, sharp and immediate, like a preview of his own undoing. He stepped aside quickly, tugging Emma through the doorway before she could see too much. But children notice everything. She dropped her backpack on the floor with a soft thump, eyes locked on the eviction notice, still taped crooked on their own doorframe. "Are we next?" she asked, her voice flat and small, the way a question sounds when the answer is already known. He couldn't do it anymore, couldn't keep feeding her the sugar-coated lies he'd rehearsed so often. Slowly, he peeled the paper from the door and held it out for her to see. The orange sheet crinkled in his hand like a betrayal. Emma stared at the words, lips pressed together. She didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. She just stood still, her hair falling across her cheek, and absorbed the truth the way children do, quietly, deeply, without flinching. After a long silence, she looked up at him. "We can go anywhere," she said softly, "as long as you're there." The words struck harder than any notice, harder than any locked door. His knees nearly buckled under the weight of them. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the faint scent of pencil shavings and laundry soap. She was too young to understand the cost of such loyalty, and too old to let him pretend he could protect her from it. Later that night, after Emma had retreated to her room with her sketchbook, Marcus sat at the table, staring at the folded notice. His phone buzzed, startling him. He almost didn't answer, but then he saw the name. "Marcus." Victoria's voice came through, calm, but edged with something unfamiliar. "I've been thinking about our conversation." He shifted in his chair, already bracing. "Victoria, don't." "Listen," she pressed. "I can help. Temporary housing, just until you get back on your feet. Or a loan, no strings attached." The words hit like salt in a wound. Pride flared in him, hot and raw. He gripped the phone tighter. "I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," she countered, sharper now. "It's a friend offering a hand." He let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know what I need." Before she could answer, he ended the call, the final click slicing the air. He dropped the phone onto the table and pressed both palms to his eyes, ashamed of the way his voice had shaken. From the doorway, he heard the soft creak of floorboards. Emma stood there, her sketchbook tucked under one arm, her eyes too wide, too knowing. She'd heard everything. "Dad?" she whispered. He lifted his head, exhausted. "Yeah, baby." She hesitated, then said, "Maybe letting people help isn't weakness." The words landed heavier than any lecture, heavier than all the guilt he'd carried. She wasn't accusing him. She wasn't even asking. She was reminding him of something he had forgotten, that strength didn't always mean standing alone. Marcus swallowed hard, unable to speak. He looked at her, small and steady in the dim light of their kitchen, and wondered if maybe the lesson he was supposed to teach her had come full circle. The eviction notice still sat on the table between them, loud in its silence. But Emma's words lingered louder. The penthouse was quiet in the way expensive places often are, so high above the streets that even the city's constant roar couldn't reach it. Silence stretched across the glossy black piano she never played, the marble counters she never cooked on, the walls lined with art she never had time to see. Victoria Hale set her keys on the entry table and shrugged off her red coat, letting it fall across the leather chair like a discarded thought. She walked barefoot across the polished floor, her reflection following her in the glass panes that looked out over the city. She stopped at the bar, pouring herself a drink out of habit, amber liquid catching the glow of the recessed lights. She held it up, studying the way it refracted, how it almost looked warm. But when she brought it close, she couldn't drink it, not tonight. She set the glass down untouched, the ice clinking softly as it shifted. Her hands lingered on the rim for a moment before she pushed it away, as though even that distance might keep the ache inside her chest from spilling out. Marcus's voice still echoed in her ears, rough and frayed, a voice that had once carried conviction, now cracked under the weight of refusing her help. "I don't need charity." The words had stung, not because of his pride, but because of how much pain was woven into them. She'd heard desperation in plenty of voices over the years, rivals at the negotiating table, CEOs begging for mercy during hostile takeovers. But this was different. His wasn't the sound of a man losing a company. It was the sound of a man holding his life together with trembling hands. She moved toward her desk, opening the drawer she rarely touched anymore. Inside was a battered leather journal, its spine cracked, its pages swollen with old ink, and the scent of paper left too close to time. She carried it to the sofa and sat down, the journal heavy on her lap. She hadn't opened it in years, not since her early days, when she thought recording every thought might give her clarity. Most of it was filled with sloppy notes from lectures, scribbled diagrams of business ideas, half-baked goals. But as she flipped through, one page stopped her cold. The handwriting wasn't hers. It was his. She traced the letters with her finger, remembering the night he'd taken her pen and scrawled it across the paper in his neat, deliberate style. Leadership is listening louder than you speak. Back then, it had been a lifeline. She had been drowning in expectations, panicked about the kind of leader she was supposed to become, too terrified of silence because silence meant judgment. And Marcus had said it so easily, so matter of fact, before handing the journal back like it was nothing more than a truth anyone should know. She had carried those words with her for years, letting them shape her confidence, her ability to win rooms by making people feel heard. Somewhere along the way, she had forgotten. She closed her eyes, the leather rough beneath her palms. Maybe Marcus hadn't forgotten. Maybe he still carried that truth, even buried under years of exhaustion and disappointment. The thought unsettled her, not because it diminished her, but because it reminded her of how far she'd strayed from the person she once wanted to be. The city lights blinked outside the window, endless and indifferent. She could hear faint horns from below, but up here, in her glass and marble fortress, there was only the hum of electricity and the sound of her own breathing. She had built empires on this silence, used it as a weapon against her enemies, but now, alone, it felt like a mirror she couldn't avoid. She opened the journal again, reading the words over and over, as if repetition might bring them back to life inside her. Listening louder than you speak. She whispered them once into the empty room, her voice catching slightly on the last word. The untouched drink still sat on the bar, melting slowly into itself. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she sat with the journal pressed to her chest, letting the memory of his voice and the echo of his words carve a crack through the armor she had spent years building. For the first time in a long while, Victoria Hale wondered if silence wasn't power at all, but the absence of everything she truly needed. The morning had begun the same as always, Marcus checking badges at the revolving doors, Emma tucked into her corner with her sketchbook, her legs folded under her like a cat. The lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm, heels clicking, voices rising and falling, the metallic ding of elevators arriving and departing. Everything orderly, everything predictable, until the man crumpled. It happened near the seating area by the glass wall. One moment a middle-aged tenant in a navy suit was scrolling his phone, the next he was on the floor, chest heaving, hands clawing at the air. His briefcase spilled open, papers scattering like startled birds. The sound of his gasping cut through the room, sharper than any alarm. People froze at first. Then the chaos began. Someone shouted for help. Another reached for their phone. A receptionist rushed from behind the desk, panic painted across her face. The man writhed, sweat slicking his temples, his eyes wide with terror. Marcus didn't think. His body moved before his mind caught up. Clipboard tossed aside, he strode through the forming crowd and dropped to one knee beside the man. "Hey, look at me." His voice was low, calm, firm without being forceful. "You're safe. You're okay." The man's breaths came ragged, uneven, like he was drowning in air. His hands trembled violently against his chest. Marcus reached out, not grabbing, just steadying, grounding. "I need you to listen to me. Just my voice, nothing else." The lobby buzz dimmed, not because it actually quieted, but because Marcus's tone carved a circle of stillness around them. "We're going to slow down together," he continued, his words deliberate, almost rhythmic. He demonstrated, hand rising and falling like a tide. "In through your nose. Good. Hold it. Out through your mouth. That's it. Again." The man's chest hitched, but gradually the jagged rhythm began to sync with Marcus's own measured breathing. "You're not alone," Marcus said softly. "I've got you. Just follow me." Emma had abandoned her sketchbook, standing near the edge of the crowd, her small face alight with something fierce. She watched her father as though seeing him for the first time, pride radiating in the way her chin lifted, in the way her eyes refused to leave him. The receptionist fumbled with her phone, calling for EMTS, but even as she did, her gaze locked on Marcus. Staff, tenants, even passers-by who'd paused at the glass doors, all of them deferred unconsciously to the man kneeling in the uniform, his voice steadying what fear had broken. Minutes stretched, but under Marcus's quiet guidance, the man's breathing evened out. The trembling slowed. His body, once taut as a bowstring, began to loosen. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes, but they weren't terror now. They were release. Marcus nodded gently. "There you go. You're all right. Just keep with me." The siren of approaching EMTs wailed faintly outside. When they entered, equipment rattling, ready to take over, the man clutched Marcus's wrist, refusing to let go at first. Marcus bent close, murmuring reassurance, until finally, the man released him into the paramedics' care. The crowd exhaled all at once, as though they'd been holding their collective breath. Conversation sparked, hushed but urgent, eyes flicking toward Marcus as though trying to understand what they had just witnessed. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his knee, retrieving his cap from where it had fallen. To him it was instinct, training, yes, but also something deeper, something older. He didn't think of it as extraordinary, he thought of it as necessary. But from across the lobby, Victoria Hale stood frozen, unseen behind the cluster of onlookers. She had come down for a briefing, portfolio tucked under her arm, only to find herself unable to move as she watched Marcus take command without raising his voice, without demanding authority. She saw staff yield to him, EMTs nod at his instructions, strangers shift aside to give him space. This wasn't just a guard. This was a man who carried presence, who bent chaos with nothing but steadiness and breath. A man whose voice still held power enough to anchor a room. Her chest tightened, the words echoing in her mind. Leadership is listening louder than you speak. And in that moment, she knew Marcus hadn't lost it at all. He'd been carrying it with him every day, hidden in plain sight. The lobby had mostly emptied by the time Marcus returned to his post. The paramedics had wheeled the man out, staff had gone back to their desks, and tenants disappeared into elevators, their conversations already shifting to other things. Life resumed its rhythm, as though the moment had been nothing more than a ripple on the surface. But for Marcus, the weight of it still clung to his skin. His palms remembered the tremor of the man's hand. His chest still carried the echo of someone else's panicked breath. He straightened his clipboard, adjusted his cap, and tried to will himself back into the role of a shadow. "Marcus." Her voice came from behind him, steady, but edged with something he hadn't heard from her before. He turned, and there was Victoria Hale, portfolio tucked under one arm, her red coat draped neatly across her other. She gestured toward a quiet corner near the tall glass windows. "A word." He hesitated, glancing toward Emma, who was already watching with wide, protective eyes. He gave her a small nod. "Stay put, it'll be fine," before following Victoria. She didn't waste time. "Do you know what you just did back there?" Marcus shrugged, adjusting the strap of his badge. Just calmed him down. Her eyebrows lifted, disbelief flickering across her face. Just calmed him down? "Marcus, you stopped a room. Do you understand that?" People listened. Staff, tenants, even the EMTS. Everyone deferred to you. Not because you demanded it, not because of a title, because you commanded presence without force. That's leadership. He shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her words. Leadership. It sounded like a cruel joke. He shook his head, almost laughing. "I wore a uniform today so people wouldn't see me. I pick up trash, I check IDs, I write reports about loose elevator panels. That's not leadership." "It's exactly leadership," she countered, her tone sharper now. "And it's exactly what we're missing." He frowned, unsure what she was building toward. "What are you getting at?" Victoria took a breath as though measuring the risk of the words she was about to say. Hale Global is funding a new community outreach program. Underserved schools, kids who are falling through the cracks. We're trying to teach resilience, communication, presence. We've brought in experts, consultants, motivational speakers. But none of them—" She paused, shaking her head slightly. "None of them did what you just did. You took chaos and turned it into calm with nothing but your voice." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, short and sharp. "You want me to teach kids how to breathe? How to talk? I can't even keep a roof over my daughter's head." His words cracked, unguarded, and he regretted them instantly. He hated giving her that glimpse of weakness, hated how exposed it made him feel. But Victoria didn't flinch. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so it carried weight without volume. "That's exactly why your voice matters, Marcus. Because you know what it is to fight for stability. You know what it means when silence is heavier than words. Those kids don't need someone polished. They need someone real, someone who understands." He stared at her, searching for the catch, the hidden angle. This was Victoria Hale, after all. Woman who had built empires out of boardrooms, who turned rivals into rubble with a single contract. And yet, standing in front of him now, her eyes steady and her tone earnest, he couldn't find the mask. "I'm not qualified," he muttered. "Qualified?" She almost smiled, though it carried no condescension. "Marcus, what you did today can't be taught in a seminar. It can't be earned by degrees. It's lived, it's carried, and you've been carrying it longer than you realize." He looked away, out through the glass where the city churned on, unaware. Inside, his chest burned with equal parts pride and shame. To believe her meant admitting he might still be more than what life had whittled him into. To accept her offer meant stepping into a light he hadn't felt in years. Behind them, Emma shifted in her chair, sketchbook open, her pencil scratching across the page. He caught sight of her reflection in the glass. Small, steady, waiting. He exhaled slowly. "I'll think about it." Victoria nodded once, as though she knew she'd already opened the door, and all he had to do was step through. The apartment was dark except for the thin strip of streetlight sneaking past the blinds. Marcus sat at the table, elbows braced against the wood, staring at the eviction notice folded neatly in front of him. It wasn't the paper itself that weighed on him, but everything it meant. Failure, endings, the humiliation of being pushed out of a place that had been home. He turned it over and over in his hands, as if by wearing down the edges he could soften what was coming. Victoria's words looped in his mind, sharper with every replay. "That's exactly why your voice matters." The offer she'd laid out had startled him. Teach, lead, be seen again. But beneath the shock was something more dangerous, temptation. A chance. And to take it meant admitting he couldn't do it alone. He leaned back, rubbing both hands over his face. Pride was a strange thing. It had kept him standing when everything else collapsed, but now it felt more like a chain than armor. Pride had told him not to borrow money, not to lean on anyone, not to let Emma see him as weak. But pride didn't pay rent. Pride didn't keep food on the table. Pride sure as hell wouldn't stop the movers when they came knocking tomorrow. From down the short hall came the sound of Emma's breathing, soft and steady, the rhythm of a child who still believed safety was something her father could provide. Marcus rose quietly and walked to her room. She was curled under the blanket, sketchbook fallen open at her side, a half-finished drawing of the two of them standing in front of their apartment door. Her hand still rested on the page, pencil clutched loosely in her fingers. He stood in the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall. Every part of him ached with the truth. Pride didn't keep children safe. Choices did. Even the ones that scraped your dignity raw. His eyes stung. He whispered before he could stop himself, voice catching in the stillness, "Rachel, what would you want me to do?" The name filled the room like a prayer. He hadn't said it out loud in months, maybe longer. Rachel, his wife, his compass, gone too soon. He pictured her smile, the way she used to tease him for being stubborn, the way she'd tell him pride was only good for polishing boots, not raising children. He pressed his hand to the doorframe, bowing his head, waiting for something, an answer, a sign, anything. All he heard was Emma's steady breath. Back in the kitchen, dawn began to leak through the blinds, softening the edges of the room. The world outside was already stirring, cars coughing to life, neighbors dragging bins to the curb. Marcus sat at the table again, the phone heavy in his hand. He scrolled to her number, hesitated. His thumb hovered. Pride screamed at him to put the phone down, to figure it out himself, to endure whatever came. But survival whispered louder, the voice of Rachel in his memory, the face of his daughter still dreaming in the other room. He pressed the call. It rang once, twice, then, "Marcus?" Her voice was alert, as if she'd been waiting. He swallowed hard, words stuck in his throat. For a moment he considered hanging up, pretending the call had been a mistake. But then he forced the sound out, rough and unsteady. "I'll try," he said. The word cracked open something inside him. Try. It was small, fragile, but it was more than silence, more than pretending. His chest tightened, and he closed his eyes, gripping the phone as though it might slip away. On the other end, Victoria didn't rush to fill the pause. She just let the silence hold. And in that silence, Marcus felt the faintest shift, like a door that had been locked for years, finally cracking open. The classroom smelled faintly of pencil shavings and floor wax, the kind of place that carried too many echoes of years past. Marcus stood at the front with a clipboard in hand, pages of notes scrawled in his careful block letters. His palms were damp. He wiped them against his trousers, clearing his throat as the dozen kids in front of him shifted in their chairs. Some stared at the clock. Others bent over their phones until a teacher hissed for them to put them away. Marcus began, his voice too soft, too uncertain. He glanced at the first line of his notes and tried again. "Today we're going to talk about resilience, about how to..." A ripple of whispers passed through the group. A boy in the second row smirked. A girl near the window stifled a yawn. Marcus felt the ground slipping under him. He pushed forward, stumbling through the next few lines, words that sounded stiff even to his own ears. He could hear himself faltering, and it made everything worse. His notes blurred in front of him. He tried to steady his breath, but the room felt too big, too bright. He'd faced down men in war zones and stared poverty in the face. But here, in front of a dozen restless kids, he felt like a fraud. In the back row, Emma sat cross-legged, sketchbook in her lap, her pencil idle. She watched her father with wide, intent eyes, her expression caught somewhere between pride and worry. She could see it, how the words weren't landing, how the kids weren't listening. And then, in a small voice that carried just enough to break through the whispers, she raised her hand. "Dad?" Marcus froze. He blinked at her, startled, clipboard still clutched like a shield. "Yeah, Em?" She swallowed, her voice steadier the second time. "Can you tell the story about when you taught me to count by listening to your heartbeat?" The words fell into the room like a stone dropped in water. The chatter stilled. The smirk faded. Every head turned, curiosity pricking at the edges of their boredom. Marcus's chest tightened. He hadn't expected that memory to surface, hadn't thought of it in years. Emma had been 5, maybe 6, restless at bedtime, begging for another story. He'd taken her small hand and placed it against his chest, told her to count the beats like numbers marching. She had giggled, miscounted, tried again, until finally she drifted off with her palm pressed against him, safe in the rhythm. He cleared his throat, lowering the clipboard slowly. "All right," he said. His voice had shifted now. Quieter, yes, but steadier. So when Emma was little, she had trouble falling asleep. "I told her the trick was already inside her. I put her hand right here." He pressed a palm against his chest. "And said, 'Count what you hear.'" 1, 2, 3. At first she laughed because it was too fast, too uneven, but then she slowed down, matched her breathing to mine, and little by little her whole body let go. She counted herself into sleep by listening to a heartbeat. The room was silent. The boy in the second row leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The girl by the window stopped tapping her shoe and stared straight at him. A dozen pairs of eyes fixed on Marcus, not with skepticism now, but with something closer to awe. He continued, his voice deepening, finding its rhythm. Sometimes life is too loud, too much. But if you can find that one thing steady enough to hold on to, whether it's your breath, a sound, a heartbeat, you remember you're not lost. You're here. You're alive, and that's where strength starts. The words didn't come from his notes. They came from somewhere older, buried, but not gone. He looked at Emma, who smiled faintly before ducking her head, pencil scratching once more across her page. Marcus straightened, no longer clutching the clipboard. His voice carried now, filling the room without force, without strain. The kids leaned in, and the stillness they gave him was worth more than any applause. Unseen in the doorway, Victoria Hale stood with her arms folded, portfolio forgotten at her side. Her throat was tight, her eyes shimmering. She had come expecting to check on logistics, to ensure the program was running smoothly. Instead, she found herself watching a man who had once been reduced to shadows stand at the front of a room and draw silence from chaos with nothing but presence. And for the first time in years, she felt her own walls tremble. The evening air was soft with the faint hum of the city as Marcus locked up the community center. The kids had gone, their laughter still lingering in the hallways like a song that refused to fade. Emma walked ahead with her sketchbook tucked under her arm, skipping lightly down the steps, her energy still bright even after a long day. She hummed to herself, lost in her drawings, leaving Marcus and Victoria a few quiet moments in the shadows of the streetlights. Victoria stood beside him, her heels clicking once before she slipped them off, holding them loosely by the straps. It startled him, this small act of unpolished comfort, like watching armor fall away piece by piece. She sighed and leaned against the railing, her red coat draped over her shoulders like it had grown heavier in the last few hours. For a long moment she didn't speak. She simply watched the street, her profile lit by the glow of passing headlights. "You made them listen," she said finally, her voice soft, not businesslike. "Not because you demanded it, because you gave them something real." Marcus shifted, uncomfortable under her praise. "I just talked," he muttered. She turned her gaze to him, steady and unflinching. "No, Marcus. You gave them stillness in a world that doesn't stop moving. That's rare." He didn't answer. He wasn't good at compliments, never had been. Instead, he crossed his arms and stared out at the city, letting the silence stretch. Victoria exhaled slowly. "You know," she began, her tone quieter now, "I've been scared most of my life, too." The words surprised him. He looked at her, expecting a smirk, a quick correction, but her eyes were serious, searching. "Scared of silence," she continued, "because silence meant judgment. Scared of failure, because failure meant I wasn't enough. Scared of not being worthy of everything people expected me to be." Her fingers tightened around the straps of her shoes. "I filled my life with noise, meetings, deals, headlines, because if it was loud enough, maybe no one would notice how hollow it felt inside. And it worked for a while. But tonight, watching you," she shook her head as though she couldn't quite find the right word, "you made me realize I've been building walls out of fear, not strength." Marcus didn't rush to respond. He didn't fill the space with platitudes or advice. He just stood there, listening, the way he always had, his presence quiet but steady, his silence not empty but open. Victoria glanced at him, the corner of her mouth trembling as though she might laugh or cry, maybe both. "You're not the only one who's been hiding, Marcus." "I've been hiding too, behind glass offices and red coats and perfect posture. But when you speak, when you steady a room, it makes me feel like maybe I don't have to hide anymore either." For the first time in years, she felt the words loosen from her chest without calculation, without the careful filter of a CEO. She wasn't negotiating, wasn't persuading, she was confessing. And the confession left her lighter. Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of her admission settling over him. "You're human, Victoria." That's enough. She blinked hard, the simplicity of it hitting harder than any elaborate reassurance ever could. Human. She couldn't remember the last time she'd allowed herself to just be that. Emma called from the sidewalk, waving her sketchbook. "Dad, look!" She had drawn the three of them, herself, Marcus, and Victoria, standing side by side beneath the outline of the community center, the windows glowing like lanterns. Marcus smiled faintly at the picture, then looked back at Victoria. She was staring at the drawing with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not pride, not control, but something gentler, unguarded. Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, something unspoken settled between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. Vulnerability woven into trust. For the first time in years, Victoria Hale felt like more than a CEO. She felt like a woman being seen, and Marcus Reed, tired, scarred, stubborn, was the one who had seen her. And in that fragile space, a bond formed, quiet, tentative, but strong enough to carry them both forward. The morning air in the apartment was heavy, thick with the kind of silence that presses against your ribs. Marcus had been awake since before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with his elbows on the wood, staring at the eviction notice as if the words might change if he glared long enough. They hadn't. The clock ticked on, cruel and steady. Emma stirred in her room, humming softly to herself as she packed the last of her crayons into a backpack that looked too big for her shoulders. She hadn't asked where they were going. She just knew they were leaving. By the time the knock came, Marcus was already standing in the hallway, waiting. The landlord appeared with two movers in tow, men in gray shirts carrying dollies, and the look of people who had done this too many times. The landlord's expression was clinical, businesslike, as though this was nothing more than a calendar appointment to him. He tapped the clipboard in his hand. "Time's up, Mr. Reed." Marcus nodded stiffly. His chest felt hollow, but his body moved anyway, muscle memory of surrender. He reached for the doorknob, ready to open, ready to watch his life be carried down the hall, piece by piece. Pride whispered to him that at least he'd face this with dignity, standing tall even as the walls closed in. And then the sound came, the sharp, unmistakable staccato of heels against marble. It echoed down the hallway like a verdict. Everyone turned as the elevator doors slid open. Victoria stepped out, red coat draped over one arm, her presence filling the narrow space as though it were a boardroom. The landlord stiffened, uncertain. The movers paused mid-step. Marcus froze. She didn't look at Marcus at first. She walked straight toward the landlord, heels clicking with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. From her bag, she pulled an envelope and placed it firmly into his hands. "He stays," she said, her voice calm, final. The landlord blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" "6 months' rent," Victoria replied evenly. "Paid in full." "You won't be needing your movers today." The movers glanced at each other, shifting awkwardly, as though waiting for permission to retreat. The landlord opened the envelope, eyes widening at the signed check inside. He stammered, his well-rehearsed authority slipping. This is highly irregular." "Not anymore," she said. The hallway went silent. Marcus's chest tightened, fury burning hot beneath his ribs. He stepped forward, jaw clenched. "You had no right," he hissed. Her eyes finally met his. "I had every right," she countered softly, "to help." The words cut deeper than he wanted them to. He turned away, shame pressing hard against his pride. He hated that she'd seen him at his lowest, hated more that she'd swooped in like a savior. He wanted to shout, to tell her he didn't need this, that he could figure it out on his own. But before he could, Emma slipped past him. She ran straight into Victoria's arms, hugging her fiercely, small fingers gripping the sleeve of her coat. Her voice wavered, but was strong enough to echo in the hall. "Thank you." Victoria's expression softened, her hand resting gently on Emma's back. She didn't look triumphant, didn't look smug. She just looked human. Marcus stood there, chest heaving, watching his daughter cling to the woman who had just rewritten their fate. His anger melted into something heavier, something truer. Pride had been his shield for so long, but pride didn't keep children safe. Pride didn't keep roofs over heads or crayons in backpacks. He exhaled, the sound ragged, breaking through the tension. His shoulders sagged. "All right," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The landlord, still stunned, cleared his throat and signaled for the movers to leave. They disappeared down the hall, the sound of their carts fading. The notice crinkled in Marcus's pocket like a ghost of a war already lost. Victoria looked at him once more, her gaze steady. He didn't meet it, not yet, but he didn't turn away either. Emma held her hand tightly, as if she'd known all along that this was how the day would end. For the first time in years, Marcus let his pride bend, because sometimes love demanded it. And in that bending, he felt something shift, shame giving way to possibility, anger softening into the faintest flicker of relief. The boxes were stacked unevenly in the corner, some labeled in Emma's careful handwriting, others just sealed with tape and hope. For the first time in months, Marcus wasn't looking at them with dread. They weren't evidence of eviction, of being pushed out. They were choice. They were beginnings. He stood in the middle of the new living room, hands on his hips, taking in the space as though it might vanish if he blinked. The apartment wasn't grand, but it was theirs. 2 bedrooms, clean walls, a kitchen that smelled faintly of fresh paint, and windows that opened onto a view of trees instead of the cracked brick of the old building. Down the block was a park with swings already occupied by squealing kids. Around the corner was a school Emma could walk to in 10 minutes. It was ordinary, and because of that, extraordinary. Emma kicked off her sneakers the moment she stepped inside. She ran across the wooden floor, her footsteps clapping like applause, then stopped suddenly in the middle of the room. "It echoes!" she shouted, cupping her hands around her mouth. Her voice bounced back, repeating itself, brighter and freer than Marcus had ever heard it. She spun in a circle, hair flying, then tried again, giggling when her words chased themselves along the walls. Marcus couldn't help it. He laughed. A full, unguarded laugh that startled even him with how loud it was. The sound felt rusty, unfamiliar, like finding something in a drawer you thought had been lost years ago. His chest loosened, his ribs expanding with air that didn't feel heavy. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her, and let the moment wash over him. "You like it?" he asked, though the answer was already clear. Emma threw herself onto the floor, arms spread wide as though she wanted to hug the entire apartment at once. "I love it," she said, her voice muffled against the wood. Then she sat up quickly, eyes shining. "Can we paint my room blue? Not just any blue. Sky blue, with clouds." Marcus nodded, grinning despite himself. Sky blue it is. They spent the evening unpacking little things. The mugs that didn't match, Emma's stack of sketchbooks, the picture frame with Rachel's smile forever frozen in it. Marcus placed the frame carefully on the shelf in the living room, pausing a moment with his fingers on the glass. "We made it, Rach," he whispered, too soft for Emma to hear. Later, after pizza eaten straight from the box and a half-hearted attempt at arranging furniture, Marcus sank onto the couch. Emma was curled up beside him, head on his shoulder, humming absent-mindedly as she drew another picture. She sketched the new apartment with wide windows and a sun beaming down on it, then added the 2 of them in the doorway. This time, both figures were smiling. Marcus studied the drawing, his throat tight. Stability. The word felt foreign, like a language he hadn't spoken in years. He had grown used to scarcity, to the constant edge of loss, to patching holes faster than they could tear open. But now, sitting in this space that smelled of fresh paint and possibility, he realized he wasn't waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under him. For the first time in years, he wasn't bracing. He was simply here. Emma looked up at him, holding the sketch close to her chest. "It feels different, doesn't it?" He nodded, unable to find the words. Instead, he wrapped an arm around her and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. His laugh from earlier still lingered in the air, mixing with her echo, with the promise of walls that would hold instead of collapse. That night, when he finally lay down in his new room, Marcus stared at the ceiling and listened to the quiet. It wasn't the heavy quiet of fear or the hollow quiet of loss. It was soft, steady, the quiet of belonging. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of running. The classroom was alive with sound, but not the restless kind that used to meet Marcus when he first began. It was a steady hum, kids leaning forward, parents nodding, teachers actually listening instead of watching the clock. Marcus stood at the front, no clipboard this time, no trembling hands, his voice carrying easily without ever rising above the room. Victoria slipped into the back quietly, unnoticed at first. She leaned against the doorframe, her red coat folded neatly over her arm, portfolio forgotten. She had come to observe, to evaluate if the program was gaining traction, but within minutes she realized she wasn't here as a CEO. She was here as a witness. Marcus wasn't lecturing, he was drawing them in. A boy with nervous hands tapped his pencil too hard against the desk, and Marcus didn't shush him. He crouched down, tapped along with him, then turned the rhythm into a breathing exercise. Within seconds, the boy was smiling, chest calmer. A girl in the corner mumbled that she was bad at speaking. And Marcus told her the truth, that words weren't measured in volume but in honesty. She raised her head, eyes wide, like she'd been waiting her whole life for someone to tell her that. Parents shifted in their chairs, some crossing their arms tighter as if uncomfortable, others softening as they watched their children respond. Teachers scribbled notes, glancing up often, not out of duty but curiosity. Victoria couldn't take her eyes off him. He wasn't just a man with a soothing voice anymore, he was more. He commanded not by force but by invitation, not by status but by authenticity. And the remarkable thing was how natural it looked, as if this was who he had always been, and the world had simply forgotten to see it. Marcus moved with ease now, telling a story about a soldier he once knew who counted breaths in the middle of chaos. His words were plain, unpolished, but they landed. The kids leaned closer, the adults leaned too, though most didn't realize it. He laughed softly when he stumbled over a phrase, and the whole room laughed with him, not at him. He wasn't a man fumbling for authority. He was a leader, one who had lived the weight of every word he spoke. And Victoria felt it, an ache she hadn't expected, not just admiration, not just respect. Something sharper. She needed this man, needed the way he cut through noise and reached the heart of things. She had spent years surrounding herself with advisors, lawyers, strategists, people paid to perform certainty. But here was Marcus, in a faded shirt and steady stance, creating truth in a way money could never buy. Her throat tightened. She didn't just respect him, she needed him in ways she hadn't let herself need anyone. Not since she was a young woman, clutching a journal, terrified of silence, soothed only by his voice in the quiet corners of the dorm. The session ended with applause, not the perfunctory kind, but the kind that rose naturally, hands clapping because they couldn't not. Kids gathered around him, parents too, each wanting a word, a reassurance, something to take with them. Marcus smiled, tired but genuine, giving each one his attention. Victoria stepped back into the hallway, her pulse unsteady. She pressed a hand to the wall, trying to ground herself. She had come expecting to evaluate, to measure results, to check boxes. Instead, she had been undone by the simple truth of watching him lead. When Marcus finally emerged, Emma trailing happily at his side, Victoria caught his gaze. For a moment the noise of the hallway faded. He nodded at her, a small acknowledgement, and she nodded back, though her chest ached with words she wasn't ready to speak aloud. Because she knew it now, clearer than ever. She didn't just want Marcus Reed's voice in her world, she wanted Marcus Reed, and that realization terrified her more than any boardroom ever had. The morning of the opening felt like standing at the edge of something Marcus had never dared to picture. The building gleamed under a clear sky, its windows catching the sunlight and throwing it back across the street like a promise. Banners hung across the entrance with the new foundation's name, words he still couldn't believe had been printed in bold letters. Not hers alone, not his alone. Both of them, their names side by side. He smoothed his jacket, the one Emma had insisted he wear, and tried to steady the weight in his chest. Crowds gathered on the sidewalk, families with children tugging at their sleeves, teachers, community leaders, neighbors who had heard whispers of what this place was meant to be, reporters clustered near the front, cameras poised, their lenses glittering like watchful eyes. For once, Marcus wasn't here as invisible security. He was here as himself, though that truth still felt strange against his skin. Emma stood proudly at the center, her hair tied back with a blue ribbon, a pair of comically oversized scissors in her hands. She looked small and powerful all at once, the way children can when they're unaware of how much light they carry. She glanced up at her father, nervous for just a moment, and he gave her the kind of smile that said, "You've already done enough simply by being here." Victoria stood on her other side, her red coat traded for a navy dress that caught the breeze, her posture as poised as ever, but her eyes were softer than the ones the press usually saw. She glanced at Marcus, and for a moment the chaos of the crowd dissolved. It was only the three of them, standing before a door that was no longer closed. The speeches blurred for Marcus. Words about vision, about community, about change, applause at the right moments. But his focus stayed on Emma, her hands gripping the scissors like they were heavier than they should be. When the cue finally came, she pressed the blades together with all her strength. The ribbon snapped cleanly, fluttering to the ground. The crowd erupted, cheers, claps, the rapid-fire strobe of cameras flashing. Emma's face lit up, pride blooming across her cheeks as she raised the scissors high. She laughed, breathless and bright, and Marcus felt something inside him loosen, something that had been bound too tight for too long. Reporters surged forward, microphones catching every scrap of sound. One voice rose above the rest. "Miss Hale, who is this man beside you?" Marcus stiffened. The old instinct rose, step back, fade into the background, let her handle it. He almost moved, but then Victoria turned to face them squarely. She didn't hesitate. Her voice carried clear, even above the din. "He's family," she said. The words cut through the crowd louder than any speech. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to pause. Emma slipped her small hand into Marcus's, her grin so wide it nearly split her face. Marcus's throat burned. He nodded faintly, trying to keep his expression steady, for the lenses pointed at him, but inside he was trembling. He looked down at Emma, who was still beaming, then back at Victoria, whose eyes met his with a steadiness that held more than professionalism, more than respect. It held belonging. The ribbon lay at their feet like a finished chapter, but Marcus knew this wasn't an ending. This was a threshold. He exhaled slowly, barely above a whisper, the words only for himself. "We're home." The cameras clicked. The crowd cheered. But none of it mattered as much as the weight of his daughter's hand in his and the echo of Victoria's declaration still hanging in the air. For the first time in years, Marcus Reed believed it. They weren't surviving anymore. They were living. And the future, uncertain as it was, felt wide open. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share where you're reading from in the comments below. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because the next story might just change the way you see hope, love, and second chances.